Get rolling.
All right, thanks, Alicia. And welcome everybody to this webinar from IC Atlanta. I'm Tom Cross. I'm the Director of Security Research here at Lancope. And what I want to talk about is some of the attacks that we've been seeing on retail institutions over the past couple of months, and also how StealthWatch can help address some of the unique challenges that I think those kinds of organizations face from an IT security standpoint. There've been a lot of unfortunate news over the past few months about significant compromises of retail organizations. So we've seen these point of sale malware. This point-of-sale malware software circulating on the internet, and some of these attacks people don't take very seriously because they've infected a lot of endpoints that don't have anything to do with retail organizations, and so it's not clear that the attackers behind them really have a good strategy for getting them on actual point-of-sale endpoints. But we did have an event almost a year ago where Zaxby's, which is a restaurant, reported that they had malware infections on a number of their point-of-sale terminals, and they were forced to disclose that customers that use their cards at certain outlets, may have had that card information compromised. And that was sort of the canary in the coal mine. And obviously, there was a great deal of concern about the target compromise that was disclosed in November of this year. A large percentage of people in the United States may have used their payment card at a Target over the course of the Black Friday shopping season. So that impacted a wide number of people. We also saw a disclosure by Neiman, and recently we learned that a hotel chain might have also been affected. We think of hotels as being a completely separate industry from retail, but in terms of their network infrastructure, they're actually quite similar. They have a lot of distributed points of presence with point-of-sale terminals processing payment information. Often there isn't an IT person on staff at those various points of presence. So ultimately, from an information security standpoint, the environment is quite similar. So the thing here is that what often happens in computer security, I guess, is that we see that there are vulnerabilities like this, like the potential for point-of-sale malware that exists out there for a long period of time, and computer security researchers will point at them and say, hey, this is a concern or a risk. And then, eventually you'll see an attacker attempt to target that risk. And if the attack is successful, if the attacker is actually able to leverage that vulnerability in an attack that successfully steals money, then you'll see other attackers sort of jump on the bandwagon because now you have this validated approach that someone can take to stealing money. So the FBI put out this statement quite recently. They said the growing popularity of point-of-sale malware, the accessibility of it on underground forums, and the affordability of it, and the huge potential profits to be made make this type of financially motivated cybercrime attractive to a wide range of actors. We believe point-of-sale malware crime will continue to grow over the near term despite law enforcement and security firms' actions to mitigate it. So I think that what you're going to see here is this bandwagoning effect. Now that it's been demonstrated that these attacks are successful, other people are going to try to pull them off. So this is a significant and ongoing concern for retail organizations. I want to talk about how these attacks took place. All too often, we look for specific aspects of an attack and attempt to plug those holes narrowly. So, for example, we tend to focus on what security vulnerability an attacker exploited, and we say that, well, that vulnerability needs to be patched, and we need to be able to detect attacks that target it. But I think that particularly people's exposure to advanced persistent threat has taught them to take a more holistic view of the process that an attacker goes through as they target networks and look at each and every stage of that behavior and attempt to build a security program that creates controls at each one of those stages. So I think that's a valuable thought process. And what I'm going to try to do is apply it to what we know about some of these retail point-of-sale attacks that have been happening. And then from that, I think that will lead to a discussion about how StealthWatch can come into play as part of that control set. So we know that these attacks must have started with a certain amount of reconnaissance. From my perspective, these retail attacks do not constitute advanced persistent threat, because I use that term exclusively to refer to state-sponsored attack activity. But the fact is that these attacks were very sophisticated. They showed a great deal of planning and operational effectiveness. There are multiple stages to these attacks where the attackers were able to worm their way into the network through a secondary access point. And so you can see a great deal of planning, a great deal of thought, and a great deal of sophistication. And so the same sort of an analytic process that you might apply in the context of advanced persistent threat makes sense to apply here. We know there was some reconnaissance. We don't know a lot about it. So I'm going to skip ahead to the exploitation phase. What is the way that the attackers have been getting into these retail networks? So we know specifically what happened in the case of Target, and in fact, there's more information that has come out today about that. The attacker launched a spear phishing attack against a company that maintained HVAC systems within Target's network. So this was a pretty traditional spear phishing campaign where malware was attached to email. People opened the email and they got malware on their computer. And then that malware proceeded to steal access credentials that they used to access Target's network. So the attacker was then able to use those credentials to get into Target's network. And although those credentials were supposed to be used to maintain HVAC equipment, in this case, the attacker was able to get access to point-of-sale equipment. But I want to take a step back and talk about this problem holistically. There have been a number of attacks against retail establishments, and there are a number of different vectors that attackers have used to launch those attacks. One vector is insecure Wi-Fi. There's this guy, Albert Gonzalez, who is now in prison, who back around 2007 stole millions of credit card numbers from different retail establishments by breaking into their computer networks. One of the ways that he did this was by cracking WEP, or wired equivalent privacy, which is an insecure early encryption technology that was being used for wireless networks. It was a poor implementation of RC4, and it was fairly easy to crack. And he was able to, so WEP was being used to secure Wi-Fi in retail establishments to protect communications between point-of-sale terminals and the back office. And so he was able to sit in the parking lot and crack that web and get in the network from which he was able to steal credit card numbers. So ultimately, as a consequence of that attack, the PCI DSS standards were updated to prohibit retailers from using web in the payment card processing networks. Another way that Gonzalez got access to networks was via SQL injection. We think of SQL injection as an attack that targets databases, and obviously attackers want to target databases because often they contain valuable information. It's, if you've got a bunch of credit card numbers, they're going to be sitting in a database somewhere, and if there's a web interface to that database, then the SQL injection vulnerability might be just the thing that you need to get in and get access to that data. But SQL injection can actually be used to do much more than that. SQL injection could be used to gain control of the computer system that the database is running on. There's a number of different ways to do that. For example, in Microsoft SQL Server, there's a feature called XP command shell. It's usually disabled by default, but if it's enabled, then an attacker who has the ability to issue SQL commands against the database could use XP command shell to issue shell commands on the underlying OS, and that's an easy way for them to get control of that computer. We often see post-authentication security vulnerabilities that could be exploited in the database software from the SQL interface. And Many organizations are slow to patch those vulnerabilities because, oh, they figure, well, it's post-authentication. It's an unlikely attack scenario. But in fact, if the attacker has a SQL injection vulnerability in the website in front of that database, they can issue SQL commands to the database, and then they can exploit a vulnerability in the database to get code execution on the underlying computer. This network map is kind of a typical network diagram where you have a firewall, and you have a DMZ, and you have an internal network. And in our DMZ, we have a web server and a database that drives that web server. So, you know, what does it gain the attacker to get code execution on that database server? Well, many times people aren't actually using this topology. The database server is sometimes behind the firewall in the internal network instead of in the DMZ, because the people that run the network think that the database is really valuable and they want to protect it, and so they think it's safer back there. But in fact, it's not. If there's a SQL injection vulnerability in the web server, the attacker can then get code execution on the database server, and if the database server is back in the internal network, they now have access to the whole internal network. The right place to put a database server is in the DMZ. But even if you control a database server in the DMZ, often that's a lily pad that you can use to hop in behind the firewall because there's some data sharing relationship between systems in the internal network and that database server in the DMZ, and you're able to use that data sharing relationship to issue SQL commands to some machine in the back-end network. So the fact is that this exact process was used to get access to retail corporate networks in order to ultimately install malware that was collecting credit card numbers. So, you know, PCI DSS requires you to audit your web applications for security vulnerabilities and put a web app firewall in front of them to protect against this sort of attack scenario. You can have a malicious insider. I'm not aware of this actually happening anywhere, but you know, if you're a reasonably competent person and a retail establishment needs to hire people, chances are pretty good that you can get a job there. And if you can get a job there, you've got a lot of access to cash registers. You may be able to get into the back office where the telecom closet is, where there's some switching equipment and some different computers. And so you've got lots of opportunities to, say, plug in a USB key that might have some malware on it and get an infection going. And once you've got your infection going, you can quit your job, and you know, no one will think twice about it. So, ironically, I mean, this is a pretty low barrier for attackers to cross, but we haven't seen a lot of incidents like that because attackers have been able to reach out over the internet in order to get their malware on these in these environments, and they haven't had to go to the trouble of pretending to get a job in these places in order to do that. So. You know, it's important that we consider the fact that access vector exists and the risks associated with it. We could also have a compromised insider. So many organizations aren't prepared to deal with the scenario where an attacker logs into their network with a legitimate username and password and proceeds to access the systems that they have. You know, we build security solutions that look for attacks. We have IPS systems that look for exploits. We have, you know, antivirus systems that look for malware. But a lot of people aren't looking at the behavior of legitimate users that have logged into the network that are not sending exploits, that are not using malware. And that seems to be exactly what happened in the Target incident. It appears that there was you know, an HVAC vendor that logged into the network using their legitimate login and password, but it wasn't really the vendor, it was the attacker that had obtained those credentials. And so, you know, from there, they were able to pivot around. I think the next stage of the attack, once the attacker has gotten access to the network, is really important. So this attacker came in with this HVAC vendor's credentials. What did they do next? Well, they've got to find the point of sale terminals that they're interested in targeting, and they've got to get access to them. So the attacker is going to be scanning around, trying to understand the network topology, trying to understand where the systems are that they want to target. And that behavior can be quite noisy. So if you've got some good internal visibility and you're looking at the behavior of authenticated credentialed users, you may be able to detect that sort of internal reconnaissance. So once the reconnaissance is complete, the attacker needs to get their malware actually installed on the point of sale terminals. The question is, what was the vulnerability in the point-of-sale terminals that the attackers were able to leverage in order to get their malware on there? There has been a lot of speculation about this question, and I want to be clear that I don't necessarily believe that any of this speculation is accurate. In fact, some of this I'm pretty sure is not correct. But I wanted to talk about these things because they have been discussed publicly as potential ways that the attacker could have successfully gotten malware on these point-of-sale terminals. One suggestion is that there was apparently a credential that was used in the attack that looks like a credential that might have been created by a software suite made by a company called BMC. BMC makes this system management, a system automation suite, and it creates an administrative account. It was alleged that this login and password that were built into the malware might have been associated with this software. However, BMC issued a statement denying that this was true, and so there's really no other information to support the suggestion that this was the vector that the attackers used to access the point-of-sale terminals. It's been suggested that there could have been a compromise of a point-of-sale software distribution system. So there might have been some central system that is used to distribute updates or patches to point-of-sale software, and the attacker might have been able to use that system in order to distribute their malware to all the point-of-sale systems. That would be an effective way of figuring out where the point-of-sale systems are. But again, we don't have a lot of evidence to corroborate that suggestion. Another thing that has been alleged is that there might have been a compromise of application whitelisting software. So if you're running point-of-sale terminals, application whitelisting could be a pretty effective strategy. What that does is it basically locks down the software configuration on the host and says that any new software that wasn't on there before is not allowed, regardless of what it is. Because point-of-sale terminals, are pretty static and people are not downloading and installing new software on them, an app whitelisting strategy is one that might work to protect them. It has been suggested that that might have been done in some of these cases, and that the attackers might have tried to compromise the application whitelisting infrastructure in order to whitelist their malware so that they could get it installed on these point-of-sale terminals. But again, this is another scenario that I'm skeptical of. It's very difficult to pull that off in practice. I think that many of these targets may not have had application whitelisting in place. Another thing that's been suggested is worm-like propagation, that the malware propagates itself within the retailer's network until it finds itself on point-of-sale terminals. There's certainly some point-of-sale malware out there that does spread from system to system. Again, I'm not sure that that's what happened in this case, but it does go back to my previous point about the fact that the attacker is going to have to do some kind of internal reconnaissance in order to find those point-of-sale terminals. Whatever that is, that's going to be some behavior that's happening on the internal network that could potentially be detected. So, once the attacker has gotten in, they've gotten access to the retailer, they've found the point-of-sale terminals, they've got their malware running on the point-of-sale terminals. Well, the next thing they're going to do is they're going to exfiltrate data back out to the internet. And this is the process that we know was used in the Target incident. And it's interesting because there's a bunch of different hops in the process. All these point-of-sale terminals were sending a credit card data that they were collecting to a staging server. And the staging server was collecting all that data together and putting it in a single file, and encrypting that file, and sending it over to another system, which was an exfiltration server. And that exfiltration server was then sending this content up to the internet. I think that, I don't know, but I assume that the reason for this structure is that the point-of-sale terminals themselves probably were not allowed to communicate directly to the internet. There was probably some network segmentation in here that prevented that. And so the attacker created a multi-step process here in order to move the data through the different checkpoints within the network in order to get it to a place where it could be hauled out to the internet. Of course, when it was sent out to the internet, it was sent out to a legitimate third-party system that had been compromised by the attackers, and the attackers were able to move the data from there to no one knows. So that was the exfiltration process. And again, I think it's important to think about this exfiltration process because this is activity that could potentially be detected as well. It's obviously preferable to stop the malware from getting in the first place, but it's worthwhile considering how you can detect these attacks after they're already in progress. And as you'll see, many of these attacks go on for months and months before they're shut down. So the retail industry faces a number of unique IT security challenges, which I mentioned before. First of all, they have a highly distributed network environment. This diagram kind of shows you sort of an idealized retail environment. You've got this headquarters office, and you have all of these different points of presence that are in physically different locations. It's very difficult to deploy new security capabilities to these different branch offices. You've got to do a truck roll to each one in order to put a new appliance there or install new software. So the distributed nature of the infrastructure is a unique challenge that many organizations don't have to deal with. The point of sales terminals may be difficult to segment. So a lot of people have said, well, why don't they have better segmentation in these networks? Why is it possible to get information from a point of sale terminal out to the internet? Shouldn't those networks be physically disconnected from each other? That would be nice, but the reality is that it's not that simple. First of all, PCI DSS does not require segmentation. It strongly recommends it, but it doesn't require it, and it doesn't require it because it's not necessarily practical to do it in 1,000 different point of sale retail locations. There's also requirements for interconnection. So PCI DSS requires that these point of sale terminals are logging syslogs with SIM, so there has to be a SIM somewhere, and these systems have to have access to it. The point of sale systems have to access inventory management backend infrastructure so that the business can keep track of what's being bought and sold. And so that's more interconnection that has to happen. PCI DSS also requires network time protocol. So all of the point of sale terminals are going to be speaking NTP to some sort of central NTP system somewhere in the network, and then that NTP system is going to be communicating with the internet. So there is actually a need for a lot of interconnection, and the segmentation is very difficult to create. Even if you create it, it can be hard to enforce it, or it's hard to keep it in compliance because you don't necessarily have IT staff at each one of these retail points of presence. If there's some problem with the computer network, you could have the staff that's working there trying to figure it out, and maybe somebody plugs the wrong thing into the wrong port back in the telecom closet in order to get things working again, and all of a sudden the network's back up and everyone goes back to work. So keeping the network in these retail establishments clean and in compliance is very difficult in practice because you just don't have IT staff sitting on top of it 24/7. Point of sale terminals may be difficult to patch. A lot of these are embedded systems that are not designed to be updated very easily. Many of them are based on Windows XP. The end of life for desktop Windows XP is April of this year. After that point, Microsoft will not be patching any problems, including security vulnerabilities in Windows XP anymore. But there's all kinds of systems out there that still utilize it. In fact, fortunately, most of the things like a point of sale terminal or an ATM are using the embedded version of Windows XP, and the embedded version of Windows XP has support until 2016, I think. So there's a little bit more runway there, but we are at the end of life for that technology. It's actually, from an operating system design standpoint, not as sophisticated as more modern Windows operating systems in terms of its resilience to attack. And so, we really need to move off of it. But some of these systems were never designed to be upgraded that way. A compliance-focused approach to security. So this is the other thing. And I think PCI DSS is very important. I think it's very positive. It has spurred a lot of security work in different retail establishments that might not have been handled as well if not for those requirements. But at the same time, it has a tendency to set your priorities for you. If you're a retail organization, you need to comply with this, and you're going to focus on doing the things that you need to do to comply, as opposed to looking at your infrastructure and saying, what is the greatest threat to my infrastructure from an attack standpoint, and how do I focus my priorities on fixing those issues? And in some cases, that can be counterproductive, or it can draw resources away from being focused in the right areas. And so, what we'd like to say is that compliance is not the same thing as security. Compliance is the common denominator that everyone has agreed that they can reach. It is not necessarily the best footing that you could be on for your organization. So the thing that I'm really here to talk about is the fact that StealthWatch can help meet those challenges, and I think it really exhibits some of the unique capabilities of our technology that really sing in this environment. One of the keys is that we can provide economic visibility into the infrastructure itself. StealthWatch can collect net flow from the routers and switches that are already deployed in these points of presence in order to create visibility without having to do a truck roll to every single point of presence. So you can bring StealthWatch in, do some configuration, and you're up and running, and you can see stuff, and you didn't have to ship an appliance to 50 different locations throughout the country. We have network relationship monitoring that can provide a sort of virtual segmentation where physical segmentation is very difficult. I'll show you more about this feature, but this allows, if the retailer can't create physical segmentation, or it's difficult for them to enforce it over time because of compliance risk, they can use StealthWatch to create virtual segmentation and be notified when a computer like your HVAC system is communicating with something like a point of sale terminal, which could never happen, even if you can't actually firewall those things off from each other. We can perform anomaly detection to identify attacks that other security solutions miss. Like I said, a lot of security solutions are focused on detecting attack activity, exploits, malware, but when somebody logs in using a legitimate login and password and just starts accessing your network, they're not necessarily going to trigger, an exploit or malware-based security system. So it's important to look at their behavior and see if their behavior is unusual or doesn't fit their normal pattern of behavior. And that sort of anomaly detection is a way that you can detect a sophisticated attacker who's doing something that might be unexpected. Furthermore, StealthWatch provides a historical perspective of what has happened on that network, and that's really important for investigating these incidents, as I'll demonstrate. So let me go back to the fact that StealthWatch provides an economical way to get visibility into these retail environments. There's points of presence all over the country, perhaps all over the world. It's very expensive to deploy new security devices or software to these locations. StealthWatch provides a lot of bang for the buck in terms of enabling the headquarters, head office to see what's happening in these environments without having to deploy any new infrastructure. What we do is we collect net flow. Chances are very good that whatever router or switch you have at those points of presence, it already supports net flow. And you can configure it to export that stuff back up to your head office, and you can immediately get visibility into what's happening down there. The net flow flows from all of your network infrastructure up to a collection point, and that's what we make. We make a flow collector. So what this net flow consists of is an audit trail of the different transactions that have happened in the environment. For every transaction that happens, what is the source address? What is the destination address? What is the source and destination port? How much data was transmitted? In that respect, it's very different. It's very similar to a phone bill. It's internet metadata, and it can be used to understand the behavior of hosts in the environment and to investigate that behavior after the fact when you store records of these transactions. So the first thing that I mentioned you could do is utilize this visibility to see how systems in each of these points of presence are interacting and to create virtual segmentation. So what you can do is you can create these things called host groups. that contain collections of IP addresses for systems that have different functions. It's important to explain that maybe these IPs are all connected to the same physical switch, but you can put them in different host groups, and StealthWatch will automatically tell you how much traffic is flowing between them and what their interrelationship is. You can also create something called a host lock that locks down that relationship, so that if there are new services flowing between those two groups of systems, or perhaps if these systems are not supposed to talk at all, if they ever communicate with each other, you'll be immediately notified. And so this enables you to create a firewall policy, even though you can't actually physically segment these machines. And I think that this is a powerful capability that can really help retailers deal with some of the challenges of their environment where they want to do segmentation, but it's not necessarily practical. The other thing is that in addition to getting visibility into these environments and being able to monitor the relationship between hosts in the environment, the StealthWatch automatically profiles the behavior of these devices. We look at all of the network transactions that each device engages in and build histories of that behavior and statistical profiles of that behavior. And so we can tell if those systems are behaving in a way that is different from the way that they usually behave. And a lot of this behavioral anomaly detection is relevant to detecting these kinds of attacks. For example, we can detect reconnaissance if there's a system in those environments that's scanning around trying to find point-of-sale terminals, or if there's worm-like propagation going on. We can easily detect that kind of behavior. We can also detect data exfiltration. So StealthWatch has a capability where it tracks the amount of data that a system sends to the internet every day, and it forms a profile of this behavior. And so if one day that system starts sending a lot more traffic to the internet than it usually does, that's something that StealthWatch is going to highlight as a potential problem. So this is our data loss detection capability, and that could have been useful in this case because you have this exfiltration server that's FTPing all this credit card information out to the internet. That server probably didn't send a lot of data to the internet before the attacker started using it for exfiltration. So this sort of behavioral profiling could have come in handy for highlighting that something's going on that probably shouldn't be happening. In the new version of StealthWatch, which hasn't been released yet, but is just about to come out, we have a couple of new capabilities that directly relate to looking for suspicious data transfers within an environment. One of them is called suspect data hoarding. The idea behind suspect data hoarding is that you're looking for a system that is downloading a huge amount of data from other systems in the network. This is based on a behavioral profile. So if that computer does that every day, then we're not going to notify you about it, but we will notify you about it if it's a new or different behavior than we usually see. So if you think back into my diagram of how data was exfiltrated from Target's environment, you had a bunch of point-of-sale terminals sending data to a staging system, and that's actually a pattern that's typical of sophisticated attacks. And it looks very much like this diagram here. We would detect that that staging system seemed to be collecting a lot of information from the internal network, much more than it usually does. And so that could be a valuable indicator that's, again, something is happening in your environment that shouldn't be happening. In addition, the new version of StealthWatch includes an event called target data hoarding, which is sort of the reverse of suspect data hoarding. It looks for a situation where you have a server that has a whole lot of data being downloaded from it that isn't usually downloaded. So this could be very valuable if you configured it on a high value target in your environment, like a database with a bunch of credit card numbers in it, or a database with a bunch of PII. Usually you'd have systems accessing that database as a matter of the course of business and downloading data from it. But if somebody comes in and dumps the whole thing, that's a significant event, and you want to be able to know about that. So target data hoarding provides you a way of alarming if a particular system in your environment has way more data being pulled off of it than it usually does. So in addition to profiling the behavior of individual hosts, StealthWatch will also profile the behavior of the relationship between groups of hosts. Coming back to our network map here, StealthWatch can automatically tell how much data is usually transmitted, say, between the PCI zone and the NTP servers. And if that amount of data transfer exceeds the normal amount of traffic, then we can have an alarm. In addition, if that data transfer stops for some reason, we can have an alarm. We also look at other aspects of that relationship, such as the number of sessions that are being initiated. So in addition to creating a virtual firewall policy in your environment, you can say not just you're not allowed to use this service. You can say you're usually transmitting this much data between point A and point B, and that's fine. But if you transfer a lot more, I want to know about it. And that's the kind of visibility that can enable you to detect a situation where somebody is using some of the holes that you've poked in your firewall as a way of shuffling data out of a protected system into a more open environment where they can move it into the internet. And so I think that capability is directly relevant to these attacks that are happening at these retail institutions. And there are very few ways to create that kind of visibility other than through net flow collection with StealthWatch. Another important aspect of the capabilities of StealthWatch is the ability to store all this net flow to form a long-term audit trail of what has happened in the environment. This timeline here was published by Neiman Marcus, and it's a timeline of the compromise that they experienced. Their initial compromise happened on July 16th, 2013. At that point, the attacker started stealing credit card or payment information. And the attacker was there for many months, through October 30th of 2013. And at that point, the attacker said, well, I got lots of credit card numbers here, I'm done. And they shut their attack down. It wasn't until mid-December that Neiman Marcus became aware that there was a problem. And the way that they detected that this was happening is through analytics of the actual credit card transactions by the payment card organization. What they do is they look for correlations between cards that have been known to have been used in fraudulent transactions. So what they found is that many of these cards that were used in fraudulent transactions seem correlated with transactions that occurred at Neiman Marcus. So eventually the arrow pointed there. They contacted Neiman Marcus and said, we think that these cards are being stolen from your stores. Neiman Marcus began investigating the incident, and in fact, they discovered that they had been infected with point-of-sale malware, and that discovery occurred on January 1st. So you're looking at a 6-month period of time between when the initial infection occurred and the attack completed and the attack was actually discovered. In order to be able to discover an attack like that and investigate it, you've got to have 6 months of an audit trail of the activity that happened in your environment. And if you don't have that audit trail, it can be very difficult to piece together exactly what happened to you. Now, it would be wonderful if we could capture the full content of all of the communications that happen in our environment and store 6 months of it or a year of it going back so that we can go through and look at all of those details. But that's incredibly expensive. And the fact is that no one today is able to store that amount of data. But it is possible to store 6 months or a year of net flow because net flow is just the header information, just the transactional details. And with that level of detail, you can easily achieve many months of history, and it's incredibly valuable to be able to go back and investigate what happened in your environment. So there's an organization called CrowdStrike. They're a security company, and they disclosed 3 different IP addresses on their blog that they say were associated with Black POS. So Black POS is the point-of-sale malware that was used in incidents that targeted Target. They suggested that people look for connections to these 3 IP addresses on their networks. But if you're looking for those transactions in real time, I mean, everyone knows that this Target incident occurred, including the attackers. The attackers know that that Target is aware of what happened, and so obviously they're not using those systems anymore to launch attacks. All of that stuff has been burned. Really, where these IP addresses are valuable is for historical analysis. If you can go back through the history of the network transactions that have occurred in your environment and search to see if you were communicating with these IP addresses at some point in the past, that might illuminate an infection that you have. And so this is a place where NetFlow is really valuable because you have this history of all the transactions that have happened in your network. You can take these 3 IPs in StealthWatch and quickly search to find those infections and ultimately to at least assure yourself that you were not communicating with those addresses at some point in the past. So let's take that scenario and shift it a little bit. We know that the organization that was maintaining the HVAC systems at Target was compromised. And we know that the credentials that they had to access Target's network were used by the attacker to get into Target's environment. So we know that that happened. So what if your organization was also utilizing that same vendor to support your HVAC systems in your environments? You know, you'd obviously want to be able to find out if that vendor's credentials were compromised and utilized in your environment as well. So one of the things you can do with StealthWatch is you can take authentication information and you can stitch it with NetFlow. And that gives you a history of not just the network transactions that happen in your environment, but the identity of the user who was authenticated to your network at the time that initiated those network transactions. And you know, what you can do when you have that capability is you can go in and put in that username that was issued to that HVAC vendor, and you can see every network transaction that they engaged in on your network, you know, over the past few months. And you can audit it and decide whether you think that this is just the normal behavior of this HVAC vendor accessing your network, or whether this looks like attack activity where the credential may have been misused by somebody else. So there's 2 ways to get this identity information in. One is the Cisco Identity Services Engine. This is Cisco's 802.1x authentication platform, and it will feed data directly into StealthWatch. So if you're using 802.1x for authentication on wireless LANs or on wired networks, you can feed that data in, and StealthWatch will directly stitch it to the flows. Another solution we have is called the ID1000. The ID1000 will collect data from other kinds of authentication systems in your environment, such as Active Directory or LDAP, and again, stitch that authentication information to the NetFlow so that you have a record of who was responsible for every transaction that happened in your environment. And when you're trying to assure yourself regarding compromises like this, you know, this is absolutely the best way to do it. So, you know, hopefully I've demonstrated that there's a lot of value that StealthWatch can bring to bear in addressing some of the concerns that retailers have and some of the challenges they face. I think that, you know, first of all, retailers have a difficult environment to work with from a security standpoint because they have distributed points of presence all over the place. It's hard to deploy security solutions to them. They're not managed by full-time IT staff that are on site. And so StealthWatch provides an economical means to get visibility into these environments. It can provide a way to create virtual segmentation where real segmentation is impractical. It can look for behaviors that are out of the ordinary that might indicate that attack scenarios have started. And it provides an audit trail, a historic record that can be used to investigate incidents after the fact and to determine whether or not your organization was affected by an attack